The bridge
told
didn't
you,
fail
you're
when
not
they
bringing
drove
those trucks
across
across
it.
this bridge.
It failed the
We have
moment they
permits,
thought
Mr.
they
Davis.
could.
Stand aside.
The smell of wet
Not on my
concrete hit
property.
me before I even stepped outside, that morning sharp and chemical mixing with diesel fumes that hung low over the creek like a warning sign nobody else could
permits are
read.
approved.
I
I
heard
need you
the
to
engine,
finalize the
first
framing
a
by end
deep
of week.
grinding
Yes,
rumble
ma'am.
that
And
didn't
ensure the
belong
lawns are
anywhere
tidy
near my
before you leave
property,
each day.
and then the vibration came
We
up
need
through
to
the
ensure
ground
the
into my
landscaping is
boots,
completed by
steady, heavy,
Tuesday.
deliberate.
Yes, ma'am.
I already
And
knew
the
what I was
paving
going to see
materials
before
must
I
match the
reached the
sample
edge of the
exactly.
gravel. Half,
Understood.
because for the past week,
This bridge
it had
cannot
been
handle that weight. It's not
same
safe. We have
routine,
approved
different
the
trucks,
crossing based
same
on weight
arrogance.
calculations.
I
But
look
stepped
at
into
it, it's
view
shaking.
just as the
Proceeding
first
with
cement truck
caution.
rolled onto
The
my
data is
bridge,
clear,
40
Ken.
tons of rotating
It's
steel
unsafe.
and liquid weight pressing down on a
What do you expect
structure
me to say?
my father built with his own hands
Action.
back in 1987 back. When people still respected lines on a map and names on a deed, the wooden beams groaned low and strained, not snapping, not yet, but complaining like something alive being pushed too far, and I swear you could feel the tension in the air like the moment. Before a storm breaks, my name is Ethan, Caldwell structural engineer, second-generation landowner, and that little bridge wasn't just access to my house. It was the last thing my father left me that still worked exactly the way he designed it. Every bolt, every load calculation, every inch of clearance done by a man who believed that if you built something right, it would outlast the people who tried to misuse it. But here's the thing about good engineering: it doesn't just support weight, it records it. And what Victoria Hale didn't understand, standing there in her pressed, white outfit, arms crossed like she owned the horizon, was that every single pound her trucks pushed across my bridge was adding up in ways she couldn't see. She didn't even look at me. When I approached, just gave that tight smile, the kind that never reaches the eyes, and said it again like she had all week: temporary access, Ethan. Just temporary. We have permits. We're improving the community. Meanwhile, another truck lined up behind. The first and another behind that, like they'd already decided my property was theirs to schedule and manage. I tasted dust in the back of my throat, felt that familiar metallic edge of anger, but I didn't raise my voice, didn't argue, didn't block the road, because I'd already tried that. Emails ignored, certified letters, return calls routed to attorneys who spoke in polished threats about development rights and community benefit. They thought I was just another guy with land in the way of progress, something to push past, something to wear down. But what they missed, what Victoria never even bothered to look at, was the small metal plate bolted to the side of the bridge, half faded, scratched from decades of weather. 8 tons maximum load, legally registered, enforceable, and documented before her HOA even existed, before her subdivision had a name, before she ever decided this creek was part of her master plan. I ran my hand along the railing as the truck cleared the midpoint, feeling the vibration travel through old wood into steel fasteners, into the ground itself. And I counted silently like I always did: 1 crossing, 2 crossings, 3, because I wasn't trying to stop them anymore. I was measuring them, tracking them, letting them believe they were winning, letting them build faster, push harder, invest deeper. Because the truth is, the bridge wasn't the weak point they thought it was, and by the time they figured out what they'd actually been driving over, it wouldn't be the structure that gave way, it would be everything built on the assumption that they could use it without consequence. The second truck hit the bridge harder than the first, not because of speed, but because of confidence. You can hear it in the way the tires roll, steady, no hesitation, no braking like they have done this 100 times before. And that is exactly what worried me the most: the routine of it, the normalization of something that should have never been allowed in the first place. I stood there with my hands in my pockets, feeling the vibration climb through the wood into the steel brackets I personally reinforced 5 years ago after a flood season. Most people would not notice the difference, but I did. Every slight shift, every low-frequency hum, every extra inch of deflection measured itself in my head automatically, because that is what you do when you spend your life calculating failure before it happens. Victoria's crew had turned my bridge into their supply line, and what started as one unauthorized crossing had quietly become a daily operation. Sunrise meant diesel engines, backup alarms, and rotating drums filled with wet concrete, sloshing with every turn. I started waking up before the first truck arrived, just to stand there and watch, not because I wanted to stop them anymore, but because I needed the data. Installed the first load sensor under the main support beam 3 nights after that initial confrontation, small enough to stay hidden precise enough to log every pound that crossed above it, I wired it into a remote monitor inside my workshop where a simple screen began telling a very expensive story. Numbers climbed higher. Each morning, 8 tons limit exceeded 12 tons, exceeded 25 tons, exceeded over and over again each. Violation timestamp documented undeniable, and still they kept. Coming Victoria liked to make appearances around 9 in the morning, always dressed like she was about to attend a meeting instead of oversee a construction shortcut. She would stand near the entrance of the bridge, holding a clipboard, talking to contractors like she was running the entire county. One day, she finally looked at me. For more than a second, "You are watching this like you were expecting something to happen," she said, her tone calm, but edged with that same quiet arrogance I had come to recognize. I shrugged, just making sure everything holds. She smiled at that, a quick, dismissive curve of her lips. "We have engineers on this project too, Ethan." That was the moment I knew exactly how far this would go, not because of what she said, but because of what she did not bother to check. She had engineers, yes, but none of them owned the structure. None of them carried liability for it. None of them had read the original filings my father submitted when he built that bridge, filings that did not just define how much weight it could carry, but what happened legally when someone chose to ignore those limits. That afternoon, I pulled out the original documents from a weathered folder in my office. The paper still smelled faintly like dust and machine oil from my father's old workshop. Handwritten notes in the margins, calculations done long before digital models made things easy, and right there in clean type was the clause most people would skim past: maximum load 8 tons, exceeding limit transfers full structural liability to unauthorized user, enforceable under state infrastructure code. I read that line 3 times, not because I did not understand it, but because I understood it perfectly. And then I looked back at the monitor where another truck was halfway across my bridge, pushing the total recorded load past anything it was ever designed to legally support. I did not need to stop them. I just needed them to keep going. I stopped counting the trucks after day 10 because by then the pattern was locked in like clockwork. Every morning at exactly 7:15, the first engine would echo down the road, followed by that low mechanical churn of cement mixing in motion, and by 7:20 the bridge would already be carrying more weight than it was ever meant to handle, not structurally, but legally, and that difference mattered more than anything else. I sat in my workshop with a monitor glowing in front of me, lines of data stacking one after another, each entry a quiet violation recorded in perfect detail: time, stamp, axle weight, cumulative load. It was not just numbers anymore, it was evidence building itself. Without me saying a word, I added a second camera on the far side of the bridge, angled low enough to capture license plates and company markings. Nothing hidden, nothing illegal, just documentation of what they were choosing to do in plain sight. And that was the part that made it almost too easy. They were not sneaking, they were not asking, they were operating like my property was already absorbed into their project, like the line between private and public had already been erased in their minds. One afternoon, I walked down to the creek just as another truck rolled off the far, and the driver did not even look at me, just kept moving like I was part of the scenery. And behind him, I could see the development taking shape, foundations poured, framing going up, crews moving fast because time was money. And right now, they thought they were saving both by cutting through my land. I could hear Victoria's voice in the distance, giving instructions, sharp, efficient, confident, the kind of voice that assumes compliance before it is earned. I stayed where I was, listening to the water move under the bridge, steady, calm, unchanged by everything happening above it. And I thought about my father again, about the way he used to test the bridge after he built it, walking it slowly, feeling each board, checking each support, not because he expected failure, but because he respected the possibility of it. That was the difference. He built with limits in mind. They operated like limits were suggestions. That night, I drafted the letter, not emotional, not aggressive, just precise, a formal notice of unauthorized use exceeding posted load restrictions with references to state code, liability transfer clauses, and documented evidence attached. I printed it on plain paper, signed it, and sent it certified to the HOA office and to Victoria directly. I knew exactly what would happen next, because I had seen it before. They would ignore it, or worse, they would treat it like a bluff, something meant to scare them into slowing down, but not stopping. And sure enough, the next morning the trucks came anyway. Same schedule, same weight, same assumption that nothing had changed, except something had. I watched the monitor as the first crossing of the day registered well over the limit again, and I felt that same steady vibration under my feet, but now it carried a different meaning, because from this point on, every single load was no longer just a violation. It was willful negligence, documented, acknowledged, and continued. I stepped outside as the second truck approached, and for the first time in weeks, Victoria walked over to me, her heels clicking against the gravel, sharp and deliberate. "We received your letter," she said, holding it loosely like it barely mattered. "You're overcomplicating this, Ethan. It is a temporary access solution, and we are well within our rights." I nodded slowly, letting her finish, because she needed to say it out loud, needed to confirm the assumption that had been driving this entire situation. "You are choosing to continue after formal notice?" I asked, keeping my voice. Even she gave a small shrug, almost amused. "We are choosing progress." That was it right there, the line that separated what they believed from what was actually happening. I looked past her at the next truck, waiting its turn, engine idling, drum turning, full weight ready, and I realized I did not need to escalate. I did not need to block anything or argue any further, because they had just done the one thing that turns a mistake into something far more expensive. They confirmed it in writing, an action, and intent. And as that truck rolled forward onto the bridge again, I turned back toward my house, already knowing that everything from this moment on was no longer about stopping them. It was about letting the consequences catch up. The next morning felt quieter, not because the truck stopped, but because something inside me had already shifted. The sound of diesel engines still rolled in, like clockwork, but now every vibration felt accounted for, every crossing already translated into consequence before it even happened. I stood on the edge of the bridge with a clipboard in my hand, not for show, not for intimidation, just a simple habit of recording what I already knew. The numbers were climbing past limits they had acknowledged and ignored, and the air carried that same mix of concrete, dust, and fuel that had become part of my mornings. Victoria did not come outright away that day. Instead, it was one of her site supervisors, a man in a hard hat, who looked at me like I was an inconvenience. He waved a hand casually as the first truck lined up. "We were on a schedule," he said, like that explained everything. I nodded once and stepped aside, not because I agreed, but because I did not need to stop him anymore. The first truck rolled forward, heavy, steady, predictable. The bridge answered the same way it always did, with a low, strained hum that only someone paying attention would notice. And I wrote down the time, the weight estimate, and the company name printed on the side of the drum. The second truck followed closer than usual, and that told me something had changed, not in my world, but in theirs. They were accelerating, trying to make up time, pushing more volume across the same path, and that kind of pressure always shows up somewhere. Eventually, I walked along the side of the creek, keeping pace with the crossing, watching the structure from below, where most people never bother to look. The beams flexed with intolerance, the joints held exactly as designed, because the bridge itself was not failing physically. It was doing its job better than anything they had built so far, and that was the irony. They trusted it more with every pass, even as they violated the one condition that made it legally usable. I could hear voices behind me, and when I turned, Victoria was finally there, her posture sharp, her expression tighter than usual, like something in her timeline was starting to feel the strain. "We need to increase throughput today," she said to her crew without looking at me, and that was the first time I heard urgency in her voice. Not panic, not yet, but the edge of it creeping in. I stepped closer, just enough for her to notice. "You received my notice," I said calmly. She exhaled through her nose, clearly irritated. "We reviewed it, yes, and our legal team is not concerned." I let that sit for a second, because statements like that always sound stronger than they are when you say them out loud. "They're not concerned," I repeated, and she nodded slightly. "Exactly. Then you should have no issue continuing," I said, and that made her pause just for a fraction of a second, not because of the words, but because of the tone. There was no argument in it, no resistance, no attempt to stop her, just permission. And people like Victoria are used to pushing against something. Resistance gives them direction, but when you remove it entirely, it leaves them with nothing to measure against. "Go ahead," I added, stepping fully out of the way. "Use it as much as you need." Her eyes narrowed, just slightly, like she was trying to read something that was no longer visible. And then she turned back to her crew. "Keep moving," she said, louder this time, and just like that, the line of trucks began to grow longer, engines idling, drums spinning, schedules tightening. I walked back toward my house, not rushing, not looking back, because I did not need to see it anymore. I could already hear it building, the rhythm of repetition, the sound of decisions stacking one on top of another, And inside my workshop, the monitor continued to log everything silently, perfectly, each entry, another line in a record that was no longer theoretical. It was active, it was ongoing, and it was about to become very difficult to ignore. I sat down in front of the screen, watching the numbers climb, and for the first time since this started, I allowed myself a small breath, not relief, not satisfaction. Just recognition that the trap was no longer something I was preparing. It was something they were fully inside of, and they were still choosing to go deeper. By the end of the week, the sound changed again, not louder, not heavier, but sharper, like the bridge itself was starting to speak in a language only stress understands. Every crossing carried a slightly different tone, a higher pitch in the wood, a tighter vibration through the supports, nothing visible. Nothing dramatic, just subtle shifts that told me exactly how far they had pushed it and how far they were willing to go. I stood out there longer now, not because I needed more data, but because I wanted to watch the pattern complete itself. The trucks were no longer spaced out. They came in tight intervals, one after another, barely giving the structure time to settle between loads. And that was not an accident. That was pressure from somewhere above. Victoria had deadlines, investors, schedules, all the invisible forces that make people ignore limits. When those limits stand in the way of progress, I could see it in the way her crew moved faster, less conversation, more urgency. Even the drivers stopped looking around. They just followed instructions: roll forward, cross, unload, repeat, like the bridge was part of their system instead of someone else's property. I walked down beneath the structure again, placing my hand against one of the main beams, feeling the vibration travel through it, steady, controlled. Still within physical tolerance, and that was the part most people would misunderstand. The bridge was not about to fail. It was not collapsing. It was doing exactly what it was built to do: carry load and distribute stress. But the law does not care about what holds. It cares about what is allowed, and they had crossed that line days ago. I checked the monitor later that afternoon, and the numbers told the same story in clean, precise rows. Every entry, another violation. Every violation, another layer of liability, stacking higher than anything they were pouring on the other side of that creek. I zoomed in on one sequence: 3 trucks in under 6 minutes, each one well above the posted limit, each one logged with time, weight, and company identification. And I knew exactly what that meant in a courtroom: not a debate, not a negotiation, but a timeline, a pattern, a choice repeated over and over again. After formal notice had already been delivered that evening, a new letter arrived, not from the HOA directly, but from a legal firm representing the development. Short, concise language, asserting their right to temporary access, citing community benefit, and minimizing the significance of the load restriction like it was a technicality rather than a condition. I read it once, then set it down on my desk next to my father's original documents. The contrast between them was almost perfect, one built on careful limits, the other on confident assumptions. I did not respond immediately, because I did not need to. Every hour they continued was already answering for me. The next morning, I stepped outside earlier than usual, before the first truck even reached the road, and the air felt different. Cooler, quieter, like the moment right before something shifts in a way that cannot be reversed. I looked at the bridge, at the worn boards, the metal plate still fixed to the side, 8 tons maximum, load still visible, if anyone had bothered to read it. And I realized that nothing about this situation was hidden anymore. They had been warned, they had acknowledged, and they had continued anyway. I could hear the first engine approaching in the distance, that familiar low rumble growing louder with each second, and for the first time since this started, I did not feel any tension at all, just a clear, steady understanding that whatever happened next was no longer something I had to create. It was something they had already set in motion themselves as the truck came into view, lining up for another crossing. I turned back toward my house, leaving the bridge behind me, because I did not need to stand there and watch anymore. The outcome was already built into every decision they had made, and it was only a matter of time before it reached the point where even they could not ignore it. The shift did not come with a loud moment. It came quietly, like most irreversible things do. I noticed it in the schedule. First, the trucks were no longer just frequent. They were constant, a steady chain, stretching down the access road, engines idling one after another, like they were feeding something that could never quite be filled. And that told me everything I needed to know about what was happening on the other side of the bridge. They were behind, not just slightly, but enough to start cutting every corner they could find, and my bridge had become the easiest one to ignore. I stood by the window in my workshop watching the monitor as the data scrolled in. Real time, each crossing stacking on top of the last, like layers of pressure building toward a point that had already been defined long before any of this started. I leaned closer to the screen, focusing on the cumulative load totals, not because I needed to confirm anything, but because I wanted to see exactly when it would cross from excessive into undeniable. There is a difference between repeated violation and systemic disregard, and once that line is crossed, it changes how everything is interpreted, not just by me, but by anyone who understands how liability actually works. Around mid-morning, I heard something new, not a crack, not a failure, but a hesitation, a slight change in the rhythm of the crossings, like the drivers themselves were starting to feel something different under their wheels. I stepped outside and walked toward the bridge, just as another truck eased forward, slower this time. More cautious, the driver glanced down at the structure, then ahead again, like he was calculating something he could not quite define. The bridge responded the same way it always had, holding firm, distributing weight exactly as designed. But that subtle shift in behavior told me the pressure was no longer just on the structure, it was starting to reach the people using it. Victoria appeared moments later, moving faster than usual, her voice cutting through the air, sharp, controlled. "Keep them moving. Do not slow down. We do not have time for hesitation." And that confirmed it. Deadlines had tightened, margins were closing, and now every second mattered more than every rule. I stayed where I was, just outside the main path, visible, but not involved, watching as the next truck followed the same slower approach, then accelerated once it reached the center. Like the driver had been instructed not to think, just to follow through. I could feel the vibration again, steady, familiar, but now layered with something else, not stress, not weakness, but accumulation, the kind that does not show itself until everything connected to it starts to feel the weight. I walked back toward the house and opened my laptop, pulling up the compiled records, weeks of data, organized, cleanly, time stamped, categorized, every crossing mapped against the posted limit, every instance after formal notice highlighted in a separate column. It was no longer just a log, it was a complete narrative written in numbers and decisions. I attached the files to a new message, this time not to the HOA, not to Victoria, but to a regulatory office that handled infrastructure liability and compliance, the kind of place that does not respond to arguments, only to documentation. I read through it once, making sure every detail aligned, every reference clear, every violation supported by evidence. Then I sent it without hesitation. No warning, no follow-up, just a submission of fact. I closed the laptop and stepped back outside. Just as another truck rolled onto the bridge, the sound was the same, the motion unchanged, but the context had shifted completely. They were still building, still pouring, still pushing forward. But now every action they took was no longer contained within their project. It had expanded beyond it into a system that does not move fast, but never stops. Once it starts, I leaned against the railing for a moment, feeling the vibration pass through my hand into the wood, and for the first time since this began, I did not feel like I was waiting anymore. I was watching something already in motion, something that had been set in place piece by piece, crossing by crossing, decision by decision, and somewhere beyond the noise of engines and the smell of concrete, there was a different kind of response beginning to take shape, one that did not announce itself with sound or force, but with process. And once that process reached them, there would be no way to reverse it, because unlike a bridge, you can reinforce or repair the consequences of what they have been doing. We're already fully supported and moving forward without them even realizing it. The response did not arrive as a letter. It arrived as a presence, subtle, at first like a change in the air. You only notice when something familiar feels slightly off. The trucks still came, the engines still rumbled across the bridge, but there was a new vehicle parked near the far side that had not been there before. Plain white, no markings, no urgency, just stillness. And that kind of stillness carries more weight than noise. I watched from my workshop as two men stepped out, not in construction gear, not in suits either, just neutral, clean, deliberate. The kind of people who do not need to announce authority because they carry it in the way they move. One of them walked the length of the bridge, slowly, not rushing, not inspecting in a way that draws attention, just observing, hand brushing lightly against the railing, eyes tracing the structure, then pausing near the metal plate bolted to the side, 8 tons maximum. Load. He stood there for a few seconds, longer than necessary, and I knew right then the process had reached its next step. Victoria noticed them soon after. I could see it in the way her posture changed, sharper, more controlled. She approached them with that same confident stride, but her gestures were tighter, now measured instead of dismissive. I could not hear the words from where I stood, but I did not need to. Conversations like that follow patterns. She would explain temporary access, community benefit, engineering, oversight. They would listen, not interrupting, not reacting, just letting her fill the space while they collected something far more important than her explanation. They were collecting confirmation. I stepped outside, letting the sound of the next truck fill the gap between us as it rolled onto the bridge slower again. This time the driver almost hesitant as he passed the 2 men standing near the center. The vibration carried through the structure the same as always, but now it felt like it was being measured by more than just my sensors. It was being witnessed. I walked down toward them, not directly, just enough to be present within the same space. The man near the railing glanced at me briefly, then back at the bridge, then at the approaching truck, like he was aligning 3 separate points into one continuous line. Victoria's voice cut and sharper now. We are within our rights. This is a managed development with approved access. And he nodded slightly, not agreeing, not disagreeing, just acknowledging that she had said it out loud. That was all he needed. Another truck crossed, then another, each one adding to something that was no longer invisible. The second man had a small device in his hand, not large, not obvious, but I recognized it immediately. A portable load reader, not as precise as mine, but accurate enough to confirm what the structure was experiencing in real time. He held it steady for a moment, then lowered it, writing something down on a small pad. No confrontation, no escalation, just quiet documentation, the kind that does not argue, because it does not have to. I felt the breeze shift slightly, carrying the smell of wet concrete and warm metal across the creek, and for the first time since this started, I could see it from the outside, not as a conflict, not as a disagreement, but as a sequence of choices leading to a single outcome. They had been given limits, they had acknowledged them, they had chosen to exceed them. And now someone else was here to observe that pattern, without emotion, without bias, without urgency. I turned back toward the house as another truck lined up behind the last, and I noticed something else. The spacing had changed again, slightly wider now, not because they wanted to slow down, but because something in the system had already begun to adjust to what was happening. Drivers hesitating, supervisors watching more closely, conversations shorter, more focused, and Victoria no longer standing at the center of it all, but slightly off to the side, as if trying to stay ahead of something she could not fully see. Yet I stepped inside, closing the door behind me, and returned to the monitor where the data continued to scroll steady, precise, unchanged. But now it was no longer just my record. It was part of a larger one, something that had already been set in motion the moment I sent that file. And as the next entry appeared on the screen, another overload, another timestamp, another confirmation, I realized the bridge had done exactly what it was meant to do, not just carry weight, but reveal who was willing to ignore it. And now that truth was no longer contained to my side of the creek, it was being seen, measured, and understood by people who did not need to raise their voices to make it matter. It happened in the middle of a normal crossing, which is how you know it was never about a dramatic moment. It was about accumulation. The truck rolled onto the bridge, steady, controlled, the same way they all had, but this time the line behind it did not move. The spacing widened again. Engines, idling, drivers waiting like something unseen had finally reached them before anyone said a word. I stepped outside, just as the 2 men from the day before returned, only this time they were not alone. Another vehicle pulled up behind them, marked subtle but official, the kind of lettering you do not notice until you understand exactly what it represents. The first man walked straight to the side of the bridge, again pausing at the metal plate, running his fingers across the war numbers, 8 tons maximum load, then turning slightly to watch the truck settle at the midpoint, not stopping, not failing, just existing under a weight that had been exceeded too many times to count. The second man raised that same small device, holding it steady longer this time. And when he lowered it, there was no note, taking no quiet observation, just a single nod exchange between them, that kind of silent agreement carries more consequence than any argument ever. Could Victoria approached quickly, her steps sharper, now her voice already raised slightly before she reached them. We have already addressed this, she said. We are operating within a managed schedule, and there are no structural failures. Her words came out faster than before, like she was trying to close something before it could fully open. The first man turned toward her, calm, measured, and said something I could not hear, but I saw the shift in her face the moment it landed. Not confusion, not anger, just recognition, the kind that comes when you realize the conversation is no longer happening on your terms. Behind her, the line of trucks remained still, engines running, drums turning slowly, as if time itself had paused around them, waiting for something official to take shape. I walked closer, not interfering, just close enough to hear fragments, now phrases like documented exceedance, liability transfer, and unauthorized use carried across the space between them, each one precise, each one anchored in something that could not be argued away with confidence or tone. Another truck pulled up behind the first, but stopped short this time, the driver leaning slightly out of the window, looking ahead, not at the bridge, but at the people standing near it, waiting for direction that did not come immediately, because this was no longer about movement. It was about acknowledgement. One of the officials stepped forward, placing a small marker at the entrance of the bridge. Nothing dramatic, just a visible line that had not been there before, and suddenly everything felt different, not louder, not heavier, just defined. Victoria's voice dropped lower, now controlled, but tighter. We can resolve this, she said. We can adjust operations, we can limit loads moving forward. But the first man shook his head slightly, and even from where I stood, I understood what that meant. Moving forward was no longer the issue. The issue was everything that had already happened, every crossing, every load, every decision made after notice had been given and ignored. The air felt still again, but not empty, filled instead with the weight of realization settling across the sight like dust after movement stops. I looked at the bridge one more time, the same structure, the same worn boards, the same steady support, doing exactly what it had always done, holding its ground while everything around it shifted. And for the first time since the truck started coming, it was not being used, it was being recognized for what it was: a boundary, a limit, a line that had been crossed too many times to undo. I turned back toward the house as the engines began to shut down one by one, the sound fading not into silence, but into something heavier, something final. Because what had started as a shortcut had now become a record, and that record was no longer just mine. It belonged to a system that does not forget and does not negotiate once it has everything. It needs. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt settled, like something that had finally reached the point where it could no longer pretend to be anything else. The trucks remained where they were, lined up along the road, engines off, now drums still no longer turning, the smell of wet concrete fading slowly into the background as the sight adjusted to a reality it had not planned for. I stood on the edge of the bridge looking down at the creek, the water moving the same as it always had, unaffected by schedules or deadlines or assumptions. And for the first time in weeks, there was no vibration under my feet, no low hum traveling through the structure, just stillness, the kind that lets you hear everything clearly. Victoria stood near the entrance, talking in low, controlled tones with the officials, her posture still upright, still composed, but different now, less certain, less centered, like the ground beneath her authority had shifted in a way she could not correct with confidence alone. I did not need to hear the details, because the outcome had already been written long before they arrived. It had been written in every crossing, every ignored notice, every decision to continue after being told exactly what the limit was and exactly what would happen if they chose to exceed it. I walked slowly across the bridge, feeling each step connect with a structure solid, unchanged, reliable, exactly as my father built it. And I thought about the way he used to talk about responsibility, not as something you carry when it is convenient, but as something that defines what happens when things go wrong. You do not avoid it, you do not pass it on, you own it. And that was the part they never considered. They thought the bridge was just a path, something to use, something to move across without consequence. But it was never just that. It was a boundary, a condition, a line that carried weight far beyond the physical boards and steel beneath it. And once that line was crossed enough times, it stopped being a warning and became a record. I reached the far side and turned back, looking at the entire scene, the halted trucks, the scattered crews, the officials moving with quiet purpose, documenting, marking, confirming, not arguing, not negotiating, just processing what had already been established. Victoria glanced in my direction briefly, and for a moment, there was no expression, no confidence, no irritation, just recognition, the kind that does not need words because it understands exactly what has happened and exactly what cannot be undone anymore. I gave a small nod, not in victory, not in satisfaction, just acknowledgement. That this was no longer between us, it had moved beyond that into something larger. Something structured, something that does not respond to tone or pressure.